Welcome back, everybody. In the previous videos, we solved the first challenge. We saw how we were able to access the storage account, list some files, and now we need to figure out what are we going to be doing with this file for the second flag. One of the files that we've got was a PAM file. This is basically a file where we're going to be, if you open this file with Notepad, you're going to see that it is some kind of certificate or key. And if you scroll down all the way to the bottom, you're going to see something that normally you wouldn't see in these PAM files. It looks like something that has some Azure details, a tenant ID and an app ID. Now, I did create something similar, which I'm going to be showing you in the following video when we look at the setup or behind the scenes, how we can recreate this scenario. And you'll notice that in the actual file that I've created, which is called private key over here, if I scroll down, there is no Azure details. So that section where we look at begin Azure details with the tenant ID and app ID, it doesn't exist in my file. This is normally what these files look like. So what that tells me is that there is a bit of a hint over here, how and where I can be using this file. I'm being given some extra details to be able to use this file correctly. Usually this kind of information you will be needing when you log in as a service principal. In a nutshell, a service principal, the easiest way without going into too much details and elongating this video unnecessarily, you can think of service principals as something similar to service accounts, but in the world of Azure, in the world of the cloud, right? So if I have, let's say, some kind of utility, a PowerShell module that I need to run some things on my Azure, instead of creating a regular username and a password, I would create a service principal, which is similar to a service account. And with that, I feed this information to my script, and then I will allow it to log into the cloud, do its thing. Now, how can we log in with this service principal? There are multiple ways. One of the easiest ones is by creating a password. So very similar to when you have a username and a password. If I'm using a regular username, for example, Tariq@azure.com, that's going to be my username. And then I'm going to obviously have to use my password as well. That's for a regular normal user. But if I'm using a service principal, the service principal is not going to have a username, but will still need a password. So what's the replacement of the username? It's going to be the app ID. Why is it called an app ID? It's because when you want to create a service principal in Azure, you create an app, you register an app. This is basically the premise behind this. If I want to create a service principal in Azure, I need to go and register an app. And we will see how we do that in the second part of this video, where we look at the behind the scenes part. That basically is the username. The app ID is my username. So what is the password? Remember when I said there are a couple ways or multiple ways to authenticate as a service principal? One of these ways is using a password. The other way you can authenticate is by using a certificate. Very similar to what we do with, for example, SSH. With SSH, if you want to SSH into a system, you could use a username and a password. That's the easiest thing to do. If you want something a little bit more secure, but you're going to have to do a little bit more setup, then you can use a certificate. And this is very similar in Azure as well. So I have the username, which is the app ID. It's given to me in this text file. And this file looks like it's also a certificate file, a private key that is going to allow me to log in using the certificate. So let's try that. Let's try and log in as a service principal. In Azure, you are allowed, like I mentioned, to log in as a service principal. For that, we're going to be using the Azure client. This is basically the official client from Microsoft that you can use to interact with Azure, run certain commands, and so on. You are also more than welcome to use that with PowerShell. So both will work absolutely fine. To log in with the Azure client, we're going to be using the AZ login. We're going to specify that we are going to be logging in as a service principal, not as just a regular user. And of course, to log in, we need the username and the password. What's the username? It's the app ID, which has been provided for us. And the password, we are going to be using the PAM file, the private key. One more piece of information is required, which is the tenant ID. We have to specify into which tenant are we logging in. When we try to do that, we're going to get an error that says there is no subscription found. There is a quick way to bypass this by basically saying that I want to allow the login with no subscription. And here we go. Now we are logged in. One of the very first things that I like to do once I'm logged into Azure is to look at my roles, my permissions. What kind of access do I have? And for that, we are going to be using the AZ role assignment command, and we're going to be listing what kind of assignments. And I'm going to specify that I want to list my assignments, obviously, which is assigned to me, to my ID. And we can see here again that we're getting the error that says there is no subscription. I'm not assigned to a subscription, which basically is telling me that it looks like I don't have much permissions or any permissions. Let me correct myself. This means I don't have any permissions on the subscription. That does not mean I don't have any permissions on Azure Active Directory. There's a big difference between these two. Let me try to see if I can access any resources. Obviously, we would expect this to be a no, but let's try it anyway. There's no harm done in it. So I'm going to try and list the resources. Again, same error, no subscription found. Let me clear this out. Now, I did mention that there is quite a bit of difference between permissions on resources and subscriptions and Azure Active Directory permissions. By default, any user can create an application. And the application, when it's created, it's basically like a default user that's being created. That user usually will have some kind of read access over Azure Active Directory resources. What are some Active Directory resources in Azure? These could be things like groups and users. So if I try to run something like AZAD, so now I'm running this on the AD, on the Active Directory, and I'm saying show me the groups, list the groups, I am not getting an error. I'm getting an empty list, which means there are no groups, but the good thing is I'm not getting an error. So let me try that on the users. Maybe I can also list the users. So I'm going to use AZAD again for Active Directory, and I'm going to list the users. And here we go. Now we have a list of all of the users that are in the Azure Active Directory. And if you scroll up and down a little bit, try to look into the properties of these users, you're going to eventually catch one of these users where there's a password hidden somewhere in one of these fields. So you can see here that we have a password, and this is going to serve as our flag and as our password to move on to the next step. So we're going to take this and paste it and solve the second flag. And with that, we would have solved this challenge. The next part of this video, I'm going to show you how to set up the behind the scenes. So we're going to replicate this in our own subscription. We're going to create a service principal. We're going to be using a certificate as well to assign it to the service principal. And we're going to try and log in as the service principal and see if we can get a similar behavior as the CTF that we just looked at. That's it from me for now, and I will see you soon in the next video.